I'm going to very much joystick this or whatever, because actually they might discover something that we didn't know. And we're almost like we're just this observer, aren't we? We're like, wow, I didn't think of that. It's a great idea. What do you think about this? And I'm very keen on coaches being very flexible in the language. So of course there may be times where you might have to be direct in your instruction. It is a continuum, but typically what we want to try and do is we need to know that every athlete has a unique movement signature. Mm. And what we mean by that is that everyone's different. Their style is different. Their identity is different. So of course, if we know that, we've got to be very playful in how we interact with them, because we need to almost less about me prescribing my solution and even sometimes demonstrations. I'm demoing with an athlete, but my body's different to yours, right? In terms of everything, body type, everything. So, and our style is different. So I think we've got to lean more on the edge of tapping into the genius of the athlete. Mm-hmm. How can they operate in their own genius? And use language, going back to this stuff that I'm doing with my PhD and the stuff that you're doing at Emergent. Mm-hmm. How can we guide their search, but also develop them in such a way where they're given clues? So we're not telling them what to do, but we're almost tapping into their uniqueness, if you like, where they can become more adaptable. And an example in that in football might be, how can your pass eliminate 2 or more defenders? If I want to focus on passing and how we break lines with a pass, it doesn't have to be pass. It might be how can you break a line with your action? How can we play forward quickly? It might be for a dribble. It could be whatever it may be, right. You're not telling them what to do. And sometimes you may have to narrow that focus where, in my first example, it was a pass, but I'm not saying what they need to do, because they might decide, I've got to play over, or actually I'm going to have to stay on the ball in order to create the pass. So they're going to look for that information, which allows them to problem solve. And I think that's the key there,
Well, in doing so and in asking that type of question, and I know it's obviously going to change depending on the situation, but as using that example and asking that type of question, you're allowing for them to pick up invitations that are maybe inviting at greater levels of strength. And it's something that they actually have perceived that maybe you didn't perceive, because obviously you move in the world and perceive the world differently than they do, as you mentioned before. But by asking that question, you're helping educate their intention and attention to an area that allows for choice. And it allows for that movement genius, I believe is how you mentioned, or what you said there, which I think is unique. I've not heard that before. And then you also mentioned the word signature, and I think you would agree with this, but signatures, right? Because it's a continually evolving skill over time. And I think that part's the crucial piece. To answer your question, and I love it because that's a big one. Like, when do I step in? And all the listeners are like, there's probably one time. No, there's not one time. And it's obviously very, very context dependent, such as a sport. But I will tell you, there are certain themes for me. I think for some of you out there that have seen me coach in person, and for those that have not, and you hear me oftentimes, you're like, well, gosh, he's probably talking to him all the time. And that's actually not the case. I actually say less during a practice. So my pedagogical voice in a vocal way actually drops a bit. Now, that's not to say I don't get up in front in personal sometimes, but generally I'm a lot quieter throughout practice, and I allow the task manipulation, the environmental manipulations. If we're changing the time of the practice, I allow that to be louder than my actual pedagogical voice. So that's number one. So I will allow the manipulation of constraints, and I do a lot of like short notes. And so during a session, sometimes I'll do it, but a lot of times as soon as the session is finished, I will make notes on whenever I was making mentions of certain things. And the reason why I do that is I take a lot of video during practice as well. So whenever I'm doing video analysis, I have a better grasp on why that particular solution may have emerged. So let's say it's a functional or a non-functional solution to meet the nuances of the problem. If there was a functional solution, what about the dynamics there were something that allowed for that individual to successfully solve that movement problem? And then trying to unpack it from their actions and what they did versus just their verbal reasoning, number one. And then if it's non-functional, it's not like I jump in right away and I'm saying something to them necessarily. Okay, I'll give you 2 different examples. So let's say, I have an athlete, we're out on the field, and he has a nice release point, and then at the catch point, the sun hits him in the eye, he drops the ball. I'm not jumping on him right away because he dropped the ball whenever we're obviously changing the way the pass is coming in relation to the sun. But then let a couple of more repetitions unfold. And if it's something that's similar that's occurring, either I'll walk up and say, how do you feel as though the sun is going to affect the way in which you're able to track the ball in air? You know, it's not saying like, hey, obviously you dropped the pass, or hey, the sun's going to be really bright. It's going to affect your, affect your gaze and affect what you're picking up. But it's just drawing attention to it, to where he's maybe more sensitive of the environment, coming out of his catch point maybe a little bit, or coming out of the break point a little bit earlier. That way he's able to get his head around, get his ears around, he's hearing and seeing more. So he's picking up more information from a visual perspective that allows him to track the ball as it's moving. Maybe it's for him, maybe it's provoking him to chat with his quarterback about, the timing of the pass, something that's a little bit different, but it's not driven by me telling him what to do necessarily. It's more providing a little bit of information there that would help guide what he could go about doing to successfully solve subsequent problems. And some coaches may say, well, gosh, that's probably a really slow process. And maybe sometimes it's slower. It's very nonlinear, but it's also, in my experiences, it's a lot stickier, meaning I'm seeing then those actions emerge in sport, those emergent tendencies of perceiving and acting, or intrinsic dynamics. They're emerging in a way that's more functional. And we start to see this, and to borrow from a good buddy of mine, Sean Mishka's movement toolbox is starting to shape and expand over time, because they have interacted with, to your point, what you mentioned earlier, a wide breadth of problems and movement problems. So I'll close with saying, for me, it's about documenting kind of when the interactions occurred, maybe the frequency of them. And it's not like I'm counting them saying, well, 5 was too many, 4 is not enough. It's more just seeing kind of the tendencies that are occurring from a coaching perspective, along with analyzing film and seeing, could I have potentially said something there as a coach that could have educated their attention and intention to a particular area? Did I let it go too long? And that's the $1 million question, man. I don't know if there's a perfect answer, like how long is too long? And
Right.
for me, the last thing I'll end with, and this question was actually asked to me a couple months back, and I'll give you a similar example that I gave them. It's knowing that individual, right? So for me, in this particular quarterback, he's usually very, very poised. He's usually a little cocky, a little fluid with how he moves. And if I start to see, after multiple repetitions of him making a quote unquote mistake by sailing a pass, maybe he leads the receiver a little bit too far, maybe he actually even completes the pass, so he's solving the problem, but it wasn't as functional of a fit because he threw it a little bit behind him and the receiver adjusted and made the catch. When I start to see his body language, his shoulders slump forward, him slapping his hands, maybe cursing at himself under his breath, that's when I know I may need to dial the complexity down a little bit, or go in and ask him a question, kind of nudge his search a little bit, get in his movement toolbox and get in his perception of what maybe he is perceiving. And then collectively, we're seeing about him going about solving more problems in a more efficacious way.
I love it. There's so much there that you said.